All right, over to the NBA, where we saw the Utah Jazz pick up an impressive road win over the Boston Celtics last night, 117-109. It was a balanced scoring effort for Utah with six players in double figures and efficient shooting from the three-point line and the foul line. Boston got 57 combined from its dynamic duo of Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, but it wasn't quite enough on this particular occasion. Drink, we've done quite a bit of work on the Jazz and Celtics this season. What stood out to you in this one?
It's starting to seem like the Jazz might be what they look like. You look at the Jazz, right, and we want to know is they fool's gold. We want to know if the Jazz is that Atlanta Hawks team with four All Stars that ran up against LeBron and Kyrie and had to bite the dust. That's what we want to know. And it seems as if the Jazz seem to be legit. They played a legit Boston Celtic team. Boston had everything they needed. Marcus Smart was out there. You know what I'm saying? So it wasn't like Boston didn't play up to standard. They actually played very well in this game. They just didn't close well, I thought, and Utah closed the game. That's also the reason why I say maybe Utah has arrived, because remember, Utah was a team like that couldn't close games or they couldn't be competitive in those last 2 minutes or whatever the case might be. They don't look like the same Utah. And we say this, I said, let me wait till the All-Star break. Let me see what they look like at the All-Star break. Let me see what they look like after the All-Star break. They did go into the All-Star break on a bit of a losing streak. And before this game, I think they had lost either 4 out of the last 6, 5 out of the last 6, one of the two. So they came into this game kind of limping. But once they started playing, they looked like the Utah Jazz. Okay, cool. I'm with it. What impressed me about Utah was, before we do this show, you drop in notes, you drop in gems and stuff, and I'm looking at it and I'm looking at the notes and the gems, and I'm like, well, God dog, who wasn't 10 points plus on the Utah Jazz team? It seemed like everybody came out there and got in double digits. I mean, if you got in the game, you had to drop at least 10 or you ain't playing for the next 3 games. That's what it looked like. It is very, very balanced as far as the scoring standpoint. But when I look at the Celtics, one of my big things with the Celtics is, I think the last time we covered this game, I talked about how Kemba Walker showed up, not so much Jason Tatum, not so much Jaylen Brown. You got all 3 of them to really show up, to be honest, and you still lost. So it's like, if I'm Brad Stevens, what really went wrong? Was it just Utah was so hot we couldn't stop them from the 3-point line? Did they dominate the board? Like, sometimes you can lose and say, like, I thought we did what we were supposed to, and somehow we still lost. And you got to go back and find, new ways to get things done. And I think that's where the Celtics at. Now, this is the Utah Jazz. So I would say, Celtic fans, let's not panic. Let's not jump off the top of the roof. This is the Utah Jazz, and this is a regular season game on a whopping Tuesday night. You know what I mean? So we're not losing no sleep over that. But, if this continue, and I asked you this before we started the show, I'm wondering if this continues and Boston slides down and seed 5, 6, 7, or 8, and they get bounced in the first round. I mean, it might be a cause to pull Brad Stevens to the side, and I'm gonna tell you why. Don't get me wrong, Brad Stevens has done a lot of good things with Boston, but doesn't it feel like he's regressing, kind of a little bit? Like he was in the Eastern Conference Finals, and then he made it to the second round, and then like this year we don't know because the playoffs got to start. But I'm saying if he don't make it at least back to the Eastern Conference Finals, to me it seems like he's going backwards, not forwards. And I know what people are going to say. Well, when he made the Eastern Conference Finals, he had Kyrie. You knock it off. We know Kyrie wasn't nowhere to be found. He was on the back of a milk carton. Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Terry Rozier, like guys like that, Marcus Smart, that was the reason they took Cleveland to, Game 7, and the rest was history. It didn't have nothing to do with Kyrie. So I don't want to hear no Kyrie. I don't want to hear no Gordon Hayward. I'm talking about the guys they got right now. That's who got them there. So with that said, Brad Stevens, man, is looking a little iffy. And you know what? And the reason I started looking at coaching so much now is because, like the conversation we had, the average coach lasts 3 years. So if you go over that 3-year mark, you start getting more and more visibility because you done made it a lot farther than most coaches, right? And I'm looking at Brad Stevens. I'm like, yo, you're a good coach, Brad. I'm not knocking it, but at the end of the day, you are going backwards. You're not. We need you to get back to the Eastern Conference Finals. This is supposed to be a team that we foreseen in the finals by now. By now, we seen them in the finals. I mean, you roll back the footage. Me and you've been talking about, hey, the Celtics definitely NBA final team. They should, Jason Tatum doing this, Jaylen Brown doing this, Kimba come to the table, so on and so forth.
Sorry, I missed that.
But
could you say it again, please?
But as of now, we don't see that. Yeah, Siri out here doing whatever he want to do. But with that said, I don't know. They seem to be taking a step back. So what stood out to me last night for this game was the Jazz seem to be taking a step forward. The Celtics seem to be taking a step backwards. Now, take that for what it's worth. We'll see as the season go on. But I do know this. If Brad don't get these boys playing a little better, it might be a cause to be telling him to come see the owner. We need to talk.
Yeah, it's so in terms of NBA standards for coaches that we've seen, because we talked about it, whether it's Lloyd Pierce, whether it's Nate McMillan, Dwayne Casey, Billy Donovan, the list goes on and on. By those standards, yes. And I think, based off this season and how they've underachieved so far, I think it's absolutely fair to pose those questions, but at the same time, I'm not a believer that Lloyd Pierce should have got fired. I don't believe. I still think Nate McMillan should be coaching the Indiana Pacers, and I still think Billy Donovan, after what he did last year, which was his best coaching job, he should still be in OKC. So I'm definitely not, although the question is fair and it's fine for people to talk about. I in no way, shape, or form would be considering getting rid of Brad Stevens. If you want to talk to him and say, hey, man, we need a little bit more. Because right now, yes, they should be better than what they are. But not only ownership for Boston, because I couldn't even tell you what that looks like. But don't forget about a guy like Danny Ainge, who is, synonymous with the Boston Celtics. And he's been there for, a long time. And there's a whole lot of trust that the Celtics ownership has in Danny Ainge. And that would be kind of my first question. Like, what is Danny Ainge have concerns about Brad Stevens? I'm going to say no, even though, he's got to be a little frustrated about how things are playing out so far. But keep in mind, and they rolled this stat last night, Boston's had 17 different starting lineups this season. So that's, almost, one per every 2 games, you're doing something different. So there's been a lot of inconsistency. We've chronicled how much Marcus Smart hasn't played. Kemba Walker's missed time. Tristan Thompson wasn't there last night. Been a lot of moving parts for this team. And that's not to excuse it, but these things happen from time to time. And I still believe, and I think you do too, we have yet to see the best from Boston this year. At the end, when the season ends, I believe they'll be firmly in the 4th seed or 5th, depending on how Miami plays. But I think they'll be top 5. They'll be safely in the playoffs, and we'll be looking at a very compelling first-round matchup. And it is, based on what we've seen so far, they could lose in the first round, and that would be pretty disappointing. But there's still a lot of games. There's still a lot of things, a lot of games to be played, and we'll just have to wait and see. But last night, I tell you, it was an odd game because I think Boston in the first half. It didn't manifest on the scoreboard, but Boston looked like the better team for the first half, definitely. They had a lead after 3 quarters, and then in the 4th quarter it just went haywire. And they showed some some 4th quarter stats about how both teams perform in the 4th quarter, and that's what ended up happening. The Jazz, who are a pretty good 4th quarter team, and Boston just hasn't been very good in the 4th quarter. And that's what happened. Boston, they give up 40 in the 4th quarter. You give up 40 in any quarter, it's going to be hard to overcome. You give up 40. And
well, let me now. With that said, I got a question for you. When it comes to closing out games, who do that fall on the most?
You talking about for Boston or in general?
Yeah, just in general for any team, if they have a problem closing out the game, who do that fall on the most?
It's gotta, I'd hesitate to who that, who you'd pinpoint, because I think some of it may be like, do they have a clear, are their roles like clearly defined? You know what I'm saying? Like, because I think it's Jason Tatum who should be the guy that should close for you. But are the Celtics sure about that? I mean, do some people, should it be Jaylen Brown? Should it be Kemba Walker? Like, do they have, clearly defined roles there? That's the question I would have. I think it should, if I was coaching Boston, I'd want Jason Tatum to take the last shot. But I mean, that I think that is a big problem. They just aren't quite sure how to close with this group of guys. And maybe some of it is they need to just let's forget about closing and let's just play basketball. Let's screen harder. Let's cut harder. And let's just share the ball. I don't know, maybe like we saw the Golden State Warriors do for years and years. Because it seemed like once that fourth quarter got around, things got a little bit more stagnant. It was just like, give a guy the ball on the wing, see if he can, beat his man off the dribble, create something for himself, or create a wide open three. That seemed like much of the fourth quarter what they were doing, and it really wasn't all that effective. Now, on the other side, Utah was pretty splendid last night, sharing the basketball, finding open men behind the three-point line. And, it was really, I thought for Utah, they got outplayed most of this game, but they had the advantage from the three-point line. They made 9 more threes than Boston did, and the free throw disparity was something else. They shot 20 more free throws than Boston did. And so, when you win, when you have less turnovers, as Boston did, even when you win the battle of the boards, which they did, even when you are a little bit more efficient overall from the field, as they were, when you go minus 27 from three and minus 19 from the foul line, that's just too big a disadvantage in too many areas, as well as they played. And I really think for Boston, their defense early on, and for much of the first 3 quarters, and it's not so much that Utah didn't shoot the ball well, but I thought Boston's defensive intensity was pretty. They were playing defense at a high level, and they were forcing a lot of turnovers. And I think that might be the key for them. When they lock down defensively and force turnovers and get some easy baskets, I think that might be the formula for them, and that can alleviate some of those concerns about this half-court offense, which in the fourth quarter seems like it needs a little bit more. They need to oil up a little bit more. It ain't as finely tuned a machine as it should be. And not only that, the last key point where, Boston got, it just wasn't good, was individual, and that's Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart was terrible last night, especially offensively. Defensively, we know what he brings, but he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn last night. God bless him. The 2 for 10 doesn't even begin to say like what he was doing. You heard Marv Albert, and we don't know where Marv is half the time, but Marv was out there. He was like, Marcus Smart, way off. He said that multiple times, and some of it. This is Marcus Smart's 3rd game back, so I'm not going to read too much into it. But I would just, again, and I've been, pretty forgiving of Boston most of the year, but I still think when it's all said and done, we're going to be talking about Boston in the weeks to come in a more positive light. And by the way, Utah, you mentioned, they were, a little bit on a little cold streak. They were coming back to earth, as, weeks ago I said, are they this good? Are they 11 of 12 good, or whatever the streak was? They even with this win, they've come back to the pack a little bit. And I'm, as impressed as I am and as good as they are, and this is a much different team than what Quinn Snyder used to have. Remember, the Jazz used to, the defense has always been there with Quinn Snyder. The difference this year is they can shoot it, and they can shoot it from distance. And, a lot of different guys can. We've got, Clarkson comes off the bench and hits 5 threes. Ingles, who, by the way, who knew, he's the franchise leader up there in Utah for 3-point baskets. He made 4 last night. We know Conley can stroke it. Mitchell's a good 3-point shooter. So But at the end of the day, the question I have is this: are you sure about Donovan Mitchell leading the team to the NBA Finals? Are you sure about Rudy Gobert being the second best player on the NBA Finals team? I'm looking at that and I'm saying, I don't know about that. I think, it's a whole lot safer and I think a whole lot more reliable when you roll in with LeBron and Anthony Davis, when you roll in with Kawhi Leonard and, Paul George. I'm not too happy with him, but I just have way more confidence in those two duos leading you to the promised land as I do with Utah. And by the way, the same thing I'll say about Phoenix too.
Okay. Now, we're going to take Phoenix on out of this equation. We're just going to keep it with the two LA teams in Utah. I like Phoenix, but they got to show us more. These three teams are somewhat of a proven commodity. And my question is, so usually when we have a conversation like this, especially with the Lakers and Clippers compared to the rest of the West, it's usually come down to not necessarily the starting five, because usually the Lakers and the Clippers are going to have a better starting five than who they play. It usually comes to the bench. Your thing last year was, listen, the Clippers bench, those other guys, it's the truth. They got, they can go 2 deep, 3 deep in any position, The Lakers didn't really have that last year. This year, however, they do. If you ask me, I think the strength of the Lakers this year is the bench. When you have Harold, Kuzma, Caruso, those guys coming off the bench, and they put up a lot of points. They really do. Whereas the Clippers, not so much this year.
Yeah.
Utah, one of their things I noticed is their bench. Starting with Jordan Clarkson, starting with all those guys off the bench. So the reason I'm saying this is, do you think the Jazz bench could keep them competitive with like the Lakers and their bench, Clippers and their bench? Because I think that's what it's going to come down to.
I think Joe Ingles and Jordan Clarkson, in themselves, they get 34 off the bench for you last night, and Clarkson's leading the league in bench scoring at 18 a game. So I think overall, yes, but I think it's the same thing. And I like Jordan Clarkson, and he seems to have really found a home in Utah. But that finals, a couple years ago when, it was him and George Hill and Larry Nance and whatever,
whoever they acquired at the trade deadline.
Whoever else it was. And oh my Lord, Jordan Clarkson was so bad in that NBA.
All those guys was awful. And all those guys was not good.
And just these are the things I'm looking at, in the playoff time. Because you know what you're going to get from LeBron. You know what you're getting from Anthony Davis.
Right.
We believe in Montrezl Harrell, and we believe in Schroeder. And to that point about the Clippers bench, I had that belief all along that their depth would carry them, but it did not turn out that way because we know after the shutdown, Lou Williams was, doing whatever he was doing with wings. And Montrezl Harrell we don't know what happened to Montrezl Harrell.
He just didn't care to be there.
But that had a lot to do with why the Clippers underachieved in the bubble.
Right.
But yes, I am with you about the Lakers' depth, and that is why I like the Lakers right now better than the Clippers. The Jazz do have the right depth. I just think overall when you look at their best players, and it's going to be Donovan Mitchell, by the way, and maybe a little bit more about Mike Conley than Rudy Gobert, because Rudy Gobert, he's a defensive player and he dunks the ball from time to time. That's what Rudy Gobert does. So that's my question. Donovan Mitchell and Mike Conley, and maybe Bogdanovich too, whoever. Do you believe in those guys on the biggest stage? I think it's going to be, their fate will be determined by how far Donovan Mitchell can lead them. And it's not the best image when we looked last year at the last time we saw them in the playoffs and they was blowing a 3-1 lead. That's not the best look.